The guys from Ping, they've kind of shown me how much the equipment matters.
I just love that I can hit any shot I kind of want.
We're going to be able to tell some fun stories about what goes on here to help golfers play better golf.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Ping Proving Grounds podcast. I'm Shane Bacon, joined as always by Marty Jertz. And Marty, we are diving deep with a man that I know you work closely with this week.
Yeah, we got Chris Broadie here. Broadie, as he goes by amongst our engineering group and our R&D group, has a background in mathematics and is the son of one very famous statistician in the golf industry. So, Broadie, welcome to the pod, man.
Thanks for having me, Marty and Shane.
Chris, what's like dinner talk like with Pops when you guys are just discussing golf? Can you have normal golf conversations, or does it always lend down some avenue of analytics and like what's going on?
Yeah, I feel like it gets pretty deep. There's been a lot of recent work he's done on world golf rankings, college golf rankings. So he's trying to figure it out and hopefully not get too much abuse from PGA Tour pros. So it's fun to hear what's going on in his world of golf rankings.
Broadie, before your dad got into what he's kind of working on now, which is the world golf rankings, the college side of things, obviously he wrote the book Every Shot Counts. It kind of golf's version of Moneyball is I think the best analogy there for it. Tell us about your kind of childhood and some early days of some of the work and background he was doing in the golf space. How did he get interested or involved in golf, and how did you you and your brother, your family members there contribute to that?
Yeah, no, it's been very fun to see the progression of early days of interest to writing a book, getting adopted by PGA Tour. I think interestingly for me, there's always been like golf and math floating around in the background, but for me it started a lot with baseball. I remember playing Little League as like a 7-8-year-old, and probably classically my dad would start to record not just like your typical like walks, singles, but he record like where the ball was hit to, what each player on the team was doing. So he started asking me, okay, like if you were to manage this team, like what would you do? How would you set the lineup for our Little League baseball team? And like one of the first questions, like, okay, how many different combinations of lineups are there? And he's like, okay, so the first batter you can put, there's 9 different people you can choose from. Second batter is 8 different people. And so he'd be like, okay, so the number of combinations you can think through is 9 times 8 times 7 times 6. And I was like, this is kind of getting into like what the dinner time, my 7-year-old dinner time conversation was.
You're like, I just want to play baseball, man. I don't know what you're talking about.
I loved it. It was like, okay, I think he might have set up like a custom simulation for me of like, all right, we can put this player here, see how many expected runs there are. And it was like very quickly you learn that like you want to have your best player up first, so get the most possible at bats. And that was like very early, like Moneyball, like same conclusion. You want to have your highest on base percentage hitter going off first. Similarly, like we looked at like where the hits were in the field, and like no little leaguer can keep up with a fastball, so they all hit it to the right side. So you put your best defensive guy at second base.
Interesting.
So yeah, the Nuggets were rolling in pretty quick. Another one, we're going probably too deep into baseball, but another one was he asked me like what percent of the time do you need to successfully steal second in order to make it worth it? So guy on first, no outs, like when should you give the guy a green light to steal? And I guess my first like initial thought is, okay, well, what's the average success rate? Like if you can get over 7%, then go ahead. And he's like, no, there's a better way to think through it. And so we end up breaking it down. It's okay, with a man on first, no outs, your expected runs is maybe 0.8. But if you get that guy to second, it jumps up to 1.0. Now a single might score him. But then if he gets out, now you have nobody on and 1 out, and you're down to like 0.2 runs. And so it's like, okay, you just got to look at the trade-off of going from 0.8 to 1.0 or 0.8 down to 0.2. And to make it worthwhile to steal, you got to have an over 75% success rate. And I was like, oh, that's a pretty nice insight. And you can do that for what happens if there's a guy on first with 2 outs, and you can do the math again. It's like, okay, if it's 0.2 with 2 outs and a guy on first, make it successful. Now you got a guy in scoring position, you're up to 0.4. But then if you're unsuccessful, the inning's over and down to 0. But the interesting thing there is if it's 0.2 versus 0.4, all you need is a 50% success rate to make it worthwhile. And so it's like, okay, the incentive then is to send a lot of guys to try to steal second, with 2 outs and a guy on first. So a lot of things end up like correlating well to golf. Like you don't want to just look at raw stolen base percentage. Like the metric that matters for baseball is runs scored.
Yeah.
And I think that translates over pretty quickly towards golf. Like you don't really want to care about what your fairway hit percentage is, what your green hit percentage is. What really matters at the end of the day is how many shots that take you to get into the hole. And so you can hit a good drive that doesn't hit the fairway, but if it's 330 yards down there, you might be in a pretty good spot.
Marty, it's interesting, as Chris talks about this, I think about in my life, and we're similar age, Marty,
Yeah.
but in my life, like the real switch for analytics in golf to me personally was the switch from how we play par fives.
Yes.
And I feel like it was probably 15, 20 years ago, maybe now it was 25 years ago, where the idea was lay up to enough. If you can't get there in 2, lay up to a number you're comfortable with. And, for me, it was always 95 to 100 yards. I'd lay up to that number or try to. And that gave you the best chance of making birdie. And then there was a flip, I feel like, in the early 2000s where numbers and data started to tell us, no, send it as far up as you can with both golf shots because it's obviously the easiest place to get it up and down and make birdie.
Yeah, when Brody was talking about the baseball in his work his dad was doing on the baseball side, my brain was on, okay, instead of should I steal second, should I go for the par 5 and 2?
Yeah,
that was exactly
same, yeah.
That was exactly where my head was at. So yeah, it's super cool, Brody, to hear those early days of like your dad thinking about the probabilities. I mean, one of the other questions I always thought of, Shane, when I was in school, and for the listeners out there, is Brody's background is in mathematics. His degree's in math. And I'm always like, what does a math major even do? So I think Brody's a real life example here. Chris, tell us a little bit why you went that direction and some of the work you do, like day to day, like what does a math major do in the working world?
Yeah, I definitely didn't have much of a clue what I was going to do when I was in college. I was like, I know I've always liked math. I've always enjoyed having these, how can I apply data to different problems. And it was more just like, okay, I think if I do a math major, I'm going to have something's going to work out. Like it might be consulting, it might be econ, but I'll keep my options open. And I definitely gravitated towards like applied math problems, probably stemming from when I was 7 years old. And so it worked out pretty well with, I think at the end of my college career, we were doing a lot of theoretical math. And I was like, this is not quite clicking for me. And I was very lucky to get to Ping, and they're like, oh, we got whole lot of data and a whole lot of problems we want you to look at. And it was really fun to just like dive into a world of golf and math and continue with a lot of my, growing up interests.
Chris, can you give us an example of something once you came to Ping? Because your job at Ping, fitting science manager, what like giving us an example of something somebody might come to you with a problem to find a solution, like anything that's popped up throughout your career at Ping?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of really fun, different ones. One of the more fun ones was Travis Millman, one of our design engineers, was working on our G430 fairwood line, and he was like, hey, we have 10 grams of discretionary mass, which is kind of the gold currency for designers. And he was like, should we just keep on pushing MOI? We can probably get like a 5 to 10% MOI boost to this fairwood, or I can move around the mass. I can try to drop the CG location. And we kind of had a hunch that maybe like if we can get a little bit higher launch, lower spin out of our fairwoods, like it could be a pretty nice gain in terms of strokes gained, in terms of performance. But it's a hard one from a design side. Like he's not really sure how to tell that story. Like what exactly do you gain from higher launch and lower spin? And so I was able to use some of my simulation background, use our focal data where we know how people deliver fairway woods, and basically like run a virtual test of, okay, if we used your default G425 head shape with these mass properties versus a 430 with maybe your higher MOI pathway versus 430 with your lower CG pathway, or the trade-offs that you can see in terms of performance and kind of all the things that matter, not just can your longest shot go further, but what happens on your full range of impacts and miss hits. And that's where looking at through a strokes gain lens kind of helps you blend those things together. It's not just hitting the ball as far as possible every time, but it's getting that right blend of distance and accuracy. And so that was a fun one where I could tell him like, hey, this is unconventional, but you can drop the MOI by a decent amount But on that LC fairwood, if you can lower your CG location by 0.1, 0.2 inches, you'll see a pretty big boost in performance.
Yeah, Shane, Brodie's been a big part of the ability, as he talked about, of connecting the dots on our modeling capabilities. So, like, you know, Ping, we've gone through this revolution where we used to always do like tons of robot tests, but those have their limitations because, well, sometimes you want to deliver the club perfectly the same every time. It's not what humans do. So then we have Focal. We spent some time in Focal. We talked to Dr. Eric Henriksen on how that works. Chris is on the end of marrying those things together, running all these what if scenarios, these virtual simulations. So it saves us a lot of time, and it helps us answer questions with a lot more clarity, more quickly, because we can run these things virtually. And then we can kind of validate a hypothesis. Then we make the physical prototypes, test them, run them through our full suite of robot and human testing. So been able to fast track. So a lot of fun. Chris working on that.
Marty, I got a question for you, Marty, in this, because I'm interested in this because Chris's point about bringing an idea to him and having to figure it out. Marty, I know you've been big in terms of, you know, conceptualizing golf clubs and building golf clubs over the last couple of decades at Ping. How many departments are you running things by when you're coming up with a new driver? I mean, are there 10 departments you're going to and you're saying, you help us with this, you help us with this? Because I don't think people at home think about building a golf club and they're thinking Ping's trying to make a golf club that goes as long as possible, right? Or goes as straight as possible. But obviously there's 50, 100, 200, 2,000 factors that go into a driver. So, like, how many departments are you leaning on, Marty, as you're coming up with the new age, the new Ping driver?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shane. Like, to get a driver to the market, it's very super cross-functional. So it's the designing it, the 3D CAD, the joints, the mechanical design optimization. Then you're working with an innovation group, and they're working on maybe materials like our carbon fly wrap and things of that nature, in optimizing those they're kind of baking them in the R&D world, right? And getting them ready to be integrated into the design. Then you're working with kind of supply chain, manufacturing, sourcing materials, components, project engineering, which is kind of all the detailed nitty gritty to kind of ramp it up and scale the manufacturing. Quality control to make sure if we're designing a new manufacturing process, we can make it consistently to meet our brand standards. Our testing group, which makes sure it's not going to break, it's durable. We validated the performance that we want. We got, a USGA liaison in here. We got my team now, which is the fitting and performance group, which makes sure we're getting the right launch conditions. Then you got sales and marketing to kind of tell the story of it on the back end. So yeah, cross functionally, I mean, it's over 10 plus departments, and we have 80 plus engineers putting their fingerprints on it.
And Chris is a part of your team, so I mean, he's involved in so much of that kind of from start to finish process of how that golf club's going to look and perform, and how it's going to perform the best, and how it's going to function the best, as he was mentioning kind of with that 3-wood example.
Yeah, he's left his fingerprint on especially the modeling side of things here when we're looking at, being able to do virtual player test, tying it not only to our Focal data, but also our Ballnamic. Chris and I have worked together and teamed up on being able to simulate what's going to happen, how does wind affect it, and things of that nature, as well as, Shane, what's really fun, and Chris, I want to get into, is learning from on-course data. So I think one of the things we have access to now is, hundreds of millions of shots from Arcos and our partnership there, where we got on-course, really precise GPS tracking data. Chris, tell us a little story of your first experience with that, kind of, again, stepping back into your childhood here of helping collect some data from on-course play patterns, working with your dad when he was first getting into that.
Yeah, we definitely have jumped around a good amount, but yeah, definitely started, I think maybe now when I was 10, my dad's focus shifted into the golf arena, and how could we do a better job understanding golf performance. There were a bunch of different avenues. I think ShotLink was starting to come into the fold, so he knew there's some really good PGA Tour data, but there was nothing on amateur data outside of some kind of fairway hit, green hit.
You were talking about you and your dad kind of transitioning from baseball to golf. Why did he want to get into the golf analytics side? Did he get into golf at that point in his life? Did he just see opportunity there?
Yeah, I think he saw opportunity. I think there's probably some frustration of trying to record golf stats and seeing like just some really obvious potential flaws in the stats. It was like there was, as I said, like fairway hit percentage, green hit percentage. Like I think one of them was like putts per round, and it was like, okay, the leader of that stat is not necessarily the best putter. It's the person who like misses the most greens and then chips it up to 3 feet.
Totally.
So it's just like, that doesn't seem right. And then like every single stat you could just like poke some holes in. It's like, I don't know, Tiger's he's missing like 5% more fairways than average. So it's like, oh, he's a bad driver of the ball. Like, I think that was a pretty, like, I've heard that narrative still of like 2006, he's spraying it everywhere. Stephen Ames probably bought into that too and lost 9 and 8. But it's like, you see on the surface, like, okay, yeah, he's 180th in fairway hit percentage. He has to be a bad driver of the golf ball. But just doesn't quite add up because he's clearly doing very well in tournaments. And
it was a weapon of his.
Yeah.
He hit it. Maybe sprayed it a bit, but he had this distance that people couldn't keep up with at a time when that was transitioning into the game, right? So I think the focus in the quote unquote olden days in terms of statistics in golf, we were looking at these things as absolutes, right? You hit fairways, that's great. You hit greens, that's great. But not every green regulation is the same, and not every fairway hit is the same, right? And I think that's something you guys have done an unbelievable job at breaking down.
Yeah, I think it was just like, how do we get this into a context that makes sense? I think even the laying up on par fives, it's like there's some psychological safety of, oh, I can really easily hit a 7-iron to 100 yards, and I'm going to hit the green. So it's going to look good from a stats perspective. Like, I'm hitting more greens in regulation. It feels safe. And it's like, if you do take out a 3-wood and blast it around the green somewhere, you might be underneath a tree, and then it might be hard to get on the green, and you might be throwing off just like your clean round. But it was nice where you could kind of start to say, okay, well, how do we get beyond just these counting stats? And I think, I don't know, my dad did a phenomenal job of like getting into that simplest metric, which I think makes sense. Like a lot of other stats have moved that direction as well. Expected goals now is in hockey and soccer. The runs is in baseball. So it's like, it was a trend that was happening. I would say someone probably would have come up with it if my dad did not. But it helped answer some of those questions where it's like, okay, what is the most meaningful metric for golf? It's shots. And if you start looking in that perspective, then everything makes sense. Tiger's a really good driver of the golf ball. He follows the same blueprint as Rory and Bryson, and guys hit a long way, but just miss a couple more fairways. Missing one fairway per round and hitting it 25 yards past the field is actually a really, really good formula for playing good high-level golf. So yeah, it's definitely cool to see. And it was also really cool growing up to like see coaches and players start to adopt it. So I think Luke Donald, Eduardo Molinari, Chris Como, Sean Foley were a lot of guys who started to reach out and like see the insights of what looking at things from a strokes gain perspective could do. So yeah, really fun to be involved with tangentially as a 16-year-old who didn't know anything.
Broadie, let's fast forward to now, and how have you and our team here, where we've answered some of these questions, like brought that to the club fitting world, right? So you're going in for a club fitting, and you might have these kind of legacy ideas maybe in your head, like I got to hit it straighter. I got to find the middle of the face more. I need to play a shorter driver because that's what the tour players are doing. So, just let's double click on that a little bit of how somebody can take some of these concepts and principles, maybe not that they're playing tournament golf and their life's on the line, but they're going out to get fit for a new driver. What are some ideas in quick math folks can bring to the table there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fundamental question of maybe a driver fitting is like, what's better? Is it hitting as far as possible or hitting as straight as possible? And you can easily swing to the extremes. If you want to hit as far as possible, you should probably grab the longest length driver you have, crank the loft down, and hope that you hit the one really high launch, low spin nuke. And then if you want to hit it as straight as possible, it's like, okay, let's grab a shorter shaft. Let's dial back the swing speed and let's try to hit as many fairways as possible. But as with most things, the answer kind of lies in between there. And so again, it's like, how do you break down that trade-off? How do you break down that distance versus accuracy trade-off? And as expected, the way to look at it is from strokes gained and try to see, what exactly is that distance versus accuracy trade-off. And it was leaning on work that my dad did of, okay, if you could look at what's the benefit of gaining 20 yards, quantify that in terms of strokes versus what's the how much does it hurt you if you hit it, I don't know, 10 feet more offline. And so we wanted to make it as easy for fitters as possible to use this kind of strokes gain framework to analyze a driver fitting. And so the simple nuggets is if you hit 20 yards further as a PGA Tour pro, you are expected to play one shot better per round. And so that's huge. That's exactly what kind of Bryson did and maybe Fitzpatrick did when they went through gaining length. And then the interesting thing is, though, it's even more beneficial for amateur golfers. And so, like, my rough math would be a PGA Tour pro from 200 yards might average like 3.3 shots, and you bring him down to 120 yards and it's 3.0. So that 80-yard shift gained him 0.3 shots. But for a 90 golfer, he might be moving from 4.6 at 200 yards down to 4.0 at 120. So it's a 0.6 shift. Yep. And so distance is even more valuable. Like, there's more to gain moving an amateur player just 20 yards closer to the hole every time. And so that's what the math showed. For a 90 golfer, gaining 20 yards is worth 2 shots instead of that 1.0 for a PGA Tour golfer. And so you kind of use these trade-offs to develop a pretty simple rule for our fitting department that if you can gain 2 yards of distance, that will be offset by 1 yard decrease in offline standard deviation. So if you're actually if your offline dispersion goes up by a yard, that's offset by 2 yards for maybe a scratch golfer. I got that backwards. 3 yards for a scratch golfer of distance offsets 1 yard of accuracy loss. And then for a 90 golfer where distance is even more at a premium, you only need 2 yards to offset 1 yard of accuracy loss. But the nice thing there is that we have a really clean rule of thumb that, like, someone doesn't have to go to the extremes. They don't have to just maximize distance or maximize accuracy. They can say, hey, you gained 20 yards. You only lost 2 yards of offline performance. So that's going to be a clear win for you. And we can have tools in Copilot that we've mentioned a bunch on this podcast that says, okay, your expected gain on course is 1.4 shots with that new driver. That'll be a really good tool for you at the end of this fitting.
And Chris, do you have those conversations with the fitters? I mean, is this something you guys are discussing, kind of throughout the company to help people relay this information to consumers? Because I do think, like this year, Marty and I played golf in January, and he has the 2 driver system in his bag. And we've talked a lot about it on the pod, but I mean, it's been one of the biggest changes in my game I've made in the last probably 10 years.
Yeah.
is adding a 12-degree driver. Every time I play golf with somebody, they ask about it. Yep. They're always very interested in the length of the shaft and why we do it. And Marty obviously broke down the numbers, and he has the math on it. We've talked about it on the pod. I mean, if you hit 3-wood, if you hit it 300 yards, you hit 3-wood 95% of the time off the tee. Why not take a bigger head and lean on that? That's a simple thing for me to understand. How do you guys relay this information to the fitters where they can simplify it as much as possible to somebody that's looking at a driver going, I do want to gain 10, 15 yards, but what's that going to do in terms of my accuracy?
Yeah, I think that's the magic of I guess communicating with math is you have to be able to understand kind of the deep nuanced science to be able to come up with new metrics and tools for fitters, but then the power is then turning into a very simple story that everyone can understand. And I think even that example of kind of that driver, the thriver build is like how many different pieces are in play on the ping side of, like, we are leveraging our Arcos database of 100 plus million shots to understand when people use driver versus 3-wood. We're leveraging our really cool, I mean, that's even like manufacturing side of things where we can build a driver head the right weight to hit a 3-wood build. And then we can also do testing. So in our analysis and testing group, we ran that test of what happens if you hit a thriver off the tee versus a 3-wood off the tee. And, like, that's the ultimate proof is, like, how much better is it? And that's one of the more, like, jaw-dropping, like, clean wins I've ever seen in a player test. Like, the thriver was just dominating. And so, and then you can plug it into, and then we had one of the guys in our group, Max, went in. He was like, I want to test out how does this build compare? And he went into Copilot and was like, okay, let's look at what's my distance gain, what's my accuracy gain. It's like, okay, it's the clearest win in the world for a thriver. So kind of all those tools are like married together. And hopefully Copilot's kind of our avenue for fitters to get the simplest possible way to communicate to the everyday golfer.
Yeah, Shane. So Brody, I'll give him some props here. He's built pretty much all the algorithms and logic behind Ping Copilot, right? All the fun, cool math that happens there. And one of the most powerful, fun tools allows you to explore club fitting with the nuance from a strokes gain lens if you want to, right? If the fitter wants to, if the player's kind of into it. Still a little kind of hard concept, I think, for the everyday golfer to understand. I'm going to gain 0.2 of a shot. What does that mean to me? But but we're kind of on this spectrum of change in evolution with everyday golfer. They're seeing these stats on TV. They're starting to understand it more. Now you can go in and with Ping Copilot and optimize your driver or your other clubs for which one's going to be the best from a strokes gain standpoint. So, and we teach our fitters, okay, we're going to look at distance differences. We're going to look at your offline standard deviation. That's kind of how big your left-right dispersion is, right? What does your shot pattern look like? And there's a way to quantify that on a launch monitor, feed it in, and you can help it say, hey, compared to your gamer driver, this one's going to be so much better from a strokes gain standpoint. Let's try a longer driver versus a shorter length shaft and do that little A/B comparison. So really fun to be able to pass this level of nuance, which is kind of built into the strokes gain concept to the everyday golfer through Copilot, which has been tons of fun.
Yeah, and Brody, I mean, I think about this. You mentioned baseball earlier. I mean, you think about the eye rolls that came through the Moneyball era, right, with baseball, and it's like, we don't need to worry about that. That doesn't make any sense. Like, what's their ERA? Or, what's their batting average, right? I mean, these are stats that mean something in baseball. And then slowly, people started to understand what it means.
Yeah.
I think one thing that golf is doing better over the last couple of years is trying to explain this stuff. I think at broadcast at times, I try to dive a little deeper into the strokes gain stuff just to simply explain what I'm talking about, because sometimes you hear terms in a sport or in work and society and life, whatever, but you never really get explained what it is, and you just kind of take it for fact. And I think we're getting to a point now in golf where strokes gained is starting to make more sense to people at a macro level, which is huge, because for somebody like you're leaning so heavily on it. You want people to understand it because it'll help them in terms of the way they play and the way they think about golf.
It's interesting. The first thing I did when I got to Ping is we had a competitor data set of driver tests that we looked at, like different competitors, how they performed. And my boss at the time, Eric Henderson, was like, hey, how would you analyze this data? And I think he was like kind of winking in his head, like, I think he might look at this from a strokes gain perspective. But the way the data had been analyzed was, all right, how far did those balls go? Like, how many fairways did you hit? And he's like, yeah, how would you go about this? And I was like, okay, I think there might be a way to apply some of the knowledge I have of strokes gained. And so, yeah, it's been cool to be able to, I mean, even in our vocabulary, I think as designers and engineers, we've moved from maybe stat areas and how far the ball went to kind of talking this language of overall performance from a strokes gain lens. So it definitely takes time. But one other thing, what you were talking about baseball, it's like baseball maybe was ahead in some respects with Moneyball, but golf's actually been way ahead in terms of some of their advanced metrics. Like, we knew about angle of attack and club head speed. TrackMan had more of an influence kind of on the coaching community. They understood some of these tools way before like the kind of baseball analytics. They're just starting to get their head around like angle of attack. I feel like there's some funny things of like TV broadcasters being like, a launch angle swing is like a big concept in baseball. Like, they didn't quite have the terminology down for angle of attack, but it's like that's been around the golf world for I don't know, 10, 15 years now.
That's a really good point. Brody, speaking of angle of attack, I mean, think one of the problems we've solved in our group, and you were instrumental in, is helping understand like why golfers, and for me, it was always Lee Westwood. He hit down on his driver, and I was working on low spin drivers like the Answer, I-15, I-20, and they never worked for him. They fell out of the air. He'd have to change his swing, tip back. Nothing worked, so he kept playing the G10 driver, which was, kind of moderate / high spinning driver at the time when he was #1 player in the world. And we could never really answer that question of why that was. And, since then, I think you were a big part of doing a bunch of that modeling work to help us answer the question, generate this really useful chart for golfers and fitters out there that says, hey, if you do hit more down, you not only can you spin it more, but you should to be optimal. So give us a little background on how that research and analysis and modeling all came to be.
Yeah. So I think it definitely kind of goes back to my kind of first couple projects at Ping. So after kind of looking at some of that competitor data, where I was kind of looking at applying strokes gain to some of our driver data, the next project I actually worked on was looking at ball flight laws. And so that's not just the kind of underpinning there is when you have a club path, angle attack, and a face angle, a big question is where is that ball going to launch? So that's really important for coaches if they're trying to tell a golfer how to hit a functional draw or fade. I think a very common piece of teaching was you want to have the face point where the ball ends up and the path goes where you want the ball to start. And that doesn't actually quite match what we see on the physics side of things, but it kind of gets your brain kind of thinking about where should that path and face be. And so similarly on the kind of vertical side of things, it's if you have an angle of attack and then a loft in the club, a big question is where is the ball going to launch? And so we have with our focal data a lot of really good information on how the club is delivered, what that path is, and where the face is pointed. And so one of my big projects was, okay, what is that ratio? So if you have a path that is 10 degrees right and the face is pointed right at the target, where will the ball launch? And it's roughly 80%. So the ball would launch 2 degrees to the right if your face is aimed right at the target and your path is 10 degrees to the right. And we end up going through the whole club set. So a driver, that number is actually around 85%, and then down to wedges, that number is down to 70%. And so that's, I mean, one piece that kind of ties things together is like Joe Mayo's big on 10 down on a wedge. And so it's like, if you're 10 down and you want to launch the ball at 30 degrees, you have to have a 40-degree difference between your launch angle and your angle of attack. So what spin loft do you need? You actually need a 60-degree spin loft, because that 40 kind of launch minus angle attack number goes into that 60 loft minus angle attack number to get your 30-degree launch angle. So these are kind of really important fundamental kind of physics things that drive how your driver through wedges perform. And we were like, okay, we probably apply this to understanding that angle of attack and driver launch condition side of things as well. So kind of the similar kind of thought process I'll go through is what angle of attack drives your launch condition on drivers. So like a common target that I've heard thrown out is you want to hit like 17 launch and 1700 spin. And from a ball flight model perspective, that ball goes very, very far. That's where we would see like the peak of carry distance and total distance. But we know from PGA Tour data that people are living a lot more in like that 10, 11 launch and 2500 spin zone. So it's like something's missing a little bit if we're going to say that 17 and 1700 goes as far as possible, but we don't really see that on tour. And so the kind of key, kind of similar to that Lee Westwood's story, is that the key underpinning thing is that golfers, PGA Tour golfers, average angle attack is around 0. So if they want to launch a ball at 17 degrees, if they use this 85% number, they need to have a loft delivered to impact at 20 degrees. So that 20-degree loft difference turns into a 17-degree launch difference. And the issue with having a 20-degree kind of spin loft number on a driver is it's going to spin a tremendous amount.
Like crazy.
Your spin is going to be 5,000. So it's like, yeah, it's definitely not the way. You don't want a driver that's launching at 17 and 5,000 spin. And then on the other side of things, like, hey, well, what if we try to get down to 1700 spin? We know it's a knuckleball, it goes pretty far. And it's okay, probably divide that loft number by 3. Let's take that 20 degrees of loft down to 7. And now you're launching it at 6 degrees. So again, that ball flight law knowledge really matters. And it's like, okay, we're in a pickle here. You don't really want to launch it 6 degrees and 1700 spin. You don't want to launch it 17 degrees and 5,000 spin. There's some happy medium in between. And it's like, okay, this is probably something that some modeling can help us out with here. And through the power of having a ball flight model, having an impact model developed by Eric Henriksen, you can kind of nicely toggle through all the different loft options and just plug in, okay, which combination of loft and angle attack and club head speed produces the most carry distance, most total distance. And that's kind of kind of, I think, what started us down this path of trying to develop an optimal launch and spin chart. And so I might be able to pull it up, but there's angle of attack on the bottom, ball speed going up like the y-axis, and we can, for each of those combinations, go into our impact model and figure out the loft that maximizes someone's distance. And there's some cool trends that show up. I think Marty was kind of hinting at it, but if you go look at the angle of attack, that is a really clear indicator of what your spin rate should be. So if you're 4 down, your optimal spin rate is 3,000. That's the spin rate that's going to hit the ball as long as possible for you. And that's because if you had less spin than that, your launch angle of 9 degrees goes down to 6 degrees, and that ball's just going nowhere.
Yep.
And if you try to get your launch up from 8 or 9 degrees up to 12, your 3,000 spin turns into 4,000. That ball is also going nowhere. So it's counterintuitive, but 3,000 spin is the right number for someone who's 4 down. And then the other side, if you can actually move up into +4 territory, then you can get to some nicer sounding spin rates of 2,200 or something, and that will help you. That will be the new optimal. So you can move along that angle of attack kind of x-axis and see what your target spin rate should be. And I think it's pretty eye-opening for golfers.
I think, Shane, what's fun here about what Broadie just talked about is that it's a lot of numbers, a lot of angles. I'm always having to jot things down and do some trigonometry in my head, and that can go over a lot of the listeners' heads, no doubt. But what's fun is that we turned it into a practical, actionable fitting chart in a fitting tool that's helped golfers unlock distance, right? Super fun. It explains Lee Westwood, 4 down, 3,000 spin, #1 player in the world. It explains Cameron Champ, 195 ball speed. He hits down 2 degrees and he launches it at like 7.5, 8, and spins it 2,700. And that's perfect actually for him. Or it explains, like Bubba Watson, we used to his this high straight one. He'd hit up on it. He'd hit up like 5 or 6, and he would launch it at 15 to 17 with, 1,900 spin when he went to go hit his high bomb where he straightened out the curve. So this chart explains, finally, we've cracked the code on explaining, why angle of attack is super duper important. And again, Broadie, I think going back to baseball, it's just like a brand new thing in baseball. But here we are in golf. We've already cracked the code on this,
Broadie, I wanted to ask you, we are always kind of finding new tools in our bags in terms of golf. It typically starts on the pro level. I mean, I think, we were a few years ago, it felt like everybody on the planet in professional golf had a crossover. Now it's moved a little bit more to the lofted wood world. I mean, I've got a 7-wood in the bag. I think Marty's got a 7-wood in the bag. I got a 9-wood built for me a few months ago. I haven't put it in the bag yet, but I've messed around with it and I like it. I never in my life thought I would take a driving iron out of the bag. That was kind of one of my go-to shot for so long. What's the next thing, in your opinion, that we'll see over the next year or so in the professional golf world, and maybe it'll move to the amateur golf world, that will be popular amongst golfers that's maybe not the most popular thing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely hoping that it's Thriver for the PGA Tour golf world. I'm trying to stir up some fitting for myself to get it in play, because I've had some 3-woods that haven't cooperated in tournaments. So that's definitely on the top of my mind right now. 2 drivers in the bag from a lot of the time. I mean, Marty, did Tony do this at Augusta this past year? Was that something he used during the tournament?
Yeah, no, he did it at Augusta. And what's unique about his experience there, and better than me, having been around that golf course a lot and being on the telecast, is that there's some specific holes you also need to draw it, which is rare for a PGA Tour event. It's rare you get to a course where it's mandatory at a player of his length not only hit it straighter, you're definitely going to hit it off the tee. Never needs it as a second shot. If you make a mistake on 13, 15, you are laying up there, right? Because that's how you maximize your strokes gained on those particular holes. But yeah, Tony did it. But I think what's fun about that concept is that not only are we looking at the PGA Tour player that hits it very far, but Broadie, tell Shane a little bit about some of the insights we've had for the everyday golfer from the Arcos data on where they are on the golf course and how that informs maybe some of our set configuration, set design, which is not just looking at the super far hitter, but what do we see on the opposite end? The players that hit it a little bit shorter.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, a better answer to where we might be moving in the future is looking at where do people hit most of their golf shots from. So I think in our kind of gapping app logic, it's easy to just default to, okay, we want even gaps across the bag. We want to have all of your irons be, I don't know, 12 to 15 yard gaps. We have our rule of thumb of your ball speed, 7-iron ball speed divided by 10 is your target gap number. But I think what we can move towards when we have so much data is figure out, okay, for a particular golf course, what shots you're going to face. I think PGA Tour pros know this. Okay, if I have a 250-yard par 3, it's like I'm going to need that high lofted fairway to have a chance of holding that green. Trying to hit 3-iron into that green is probably almost impossible. And so we can probably start to provide that solution down to the everyday golfer of understanding, okay, you on your home course, you're hitting a lot of tee shots, and that will be your driver. And then maybe you have a ton of your shots from 80 to 120 yards. And so you might want to have a 4-wedge solution or a 5-wedge solution that's really dialed in that range. I think, I don't know, I'll give away Marty's like secret for 2025, but he was mentioning he might go to a 5-wedge setup and try to get super dialed when he has some of these shorter Arizona courses in the summer.
Do you say five wedges?
Yeah, and so my analysis on that, Shane, is for Arizona golf.
Here we go. Here, hold on one second. We got to get involved. This is Marty's 2025 New Year's resolution. We're going to get out there a few months early.
We're going 5 wedges, and it's for Arizona golf, right? It's for the the talking stick golf courses of the world, where I am 70 to 135 yards on every single approach shot on the par 4s.
Totally.
And I need tighter gaps. And then if I go to a different course, I'll go back to 4 wedges and mix it up at the top end of the bag. No problem.
What are we talking? If we're talking 5-wedge setup, I mean, because you're not, I mean, I know famously Phil did this back in the day. I mean, you're not the first person to go 5 wedges, but I'd say it went 3 to 4, and that was the big jump. And now obviously going 4 to 5. Do you have an idea of what it would look like? Do you have an idea of what that loft would look like in your bag?
We haven't finished it out, but in my head, I want to have, instead of like 13 or 14 yard gaps between wedges, I want to get them to 9 or 10.
Okay.
Right. So that's really what I want to do, as well as I need to improve my skill of being able to hit my wedges closer. But that's a little sneak preview. I think what Brodie's getting at is, let's get super nuanced into how to build somebody's bag for their individual golf course patterns, playing conditions, and things of that nature. Right, Brodie?
Yeah, and there definitely were some kind of higher level global insights that we got from Arcos data of where do people hit their golf shots from. And it's not just a very even distribution from 50 to 200 yards. It does tend to clump around 125 to 175 yards. An interesting takeaway we had from Arcos data was that it was almost irrespective of how far you hit your driver, which is maybe people not teeing up from the right tees. But we looked at, like, if you hit it 175 to 200 yards with your driver, how far is your second shot distribution? And then for a guy who hits it 250 to 275, how far is your second shot distribution? And they like lined up perfectly where all of their second shots are around that 125 to 175 yard range. And we're like, okay, let's get some more clubs in the bag at that range. That was kind of our push with the G430 line to add in kind of that 50, 45, 41 kind of wedge solution there to get some more clubs where people are hitting a lot of their golf shots. And so that's the global perspective, but then there's also maybe the iteration down the line is we can take in someone's own personal Arcos data and say, hey, given how you play golf at your home course, this is actually the set that we'd recommend for you.
And Marty, I'm assuming, when you guys dive into this Arcos data, I'm assuming that an extremely high percentage of golfers play almost 100% of their golf at the same golf course. I mean, that's something I'm sure you guys can figure out. And I think about my own golf, right? And I travel a decent amount for work, and, I get a chance to travel here and there. I'm still playing the majority of my golf at my club that I play at, right? So you want the bag to make the most sense. Like the Thriver at my club, I've talked about this a lot with my friends. The Thriver at my club for 3 holes is a mandatory golf shot. And it would be a tough shot for me with 3-wood, to be frank. So it's important for me because, again, if I'm playing my golf there, why not have a bag that makes the most sense for the course I'm playing the most?
Yeah, totally. I think that's the future. It's super exciting. I think it's, again, kind of meets that heuristic, Shane, I like to have. And we actually talked about a little bit earlier in our conversation, which is the tools that the tour player has access to. We want to try to build that and make it available to the everyday golfer. And it usually happens about a decade later. Like it was probably about 10 years ago. Chris was mapping out bunkers on Google Earth, right? And now it's all automated and appified, and and things of that nature. So being able to build somebody's bag to how they play golf, how much they travel, their specific things. I go back to our conversation we had with Sahith, where he was playing 2 clubs that went the same distance. One went higher,
Right.
one went lower. That's a way to gap your bag. Gapping's not only yardage. You can have trajectory gapping, right? Vertical gapping. It's another way to kind of think about it.
Yeah.
Brody, can you watch golf and not think about data? Is it possible for you to just sit down on a Saturday afternoon and not like I struggle with this in terms of the production broadcasting side, right? Because I've been involved in it for a number of years. As I watch golf and honestly all the sports, I find myself noticing things, right, that would make sense in my industry. Do you do the same thing when you're just sitting around to casually watch, the back nine on Sunday of a golf tournament?
Yeah, I was thinking you'd love to get invested in a major, and you're like, oh man, it's super fun to watch. Maybe U.S. Open, Bryson's feeling some pressure, and you can just get immersed in that. And then I was like, well, in my head, I'm still like, man, there could be a really cool strokes gained pressure stat that you come up with. So it doesn't take much for the wheels to start spinning. So yeah, I probably don't get too removed for it. You see someone miss a 10-footer, you're like, that's 0.4 shots. That's tough.
I love that. You're like jotting it down. 0.4. There you go. He's out.
Yeah.
Should have stole second. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. You gotta give it better edge than that.
Shane, I got a fun one. Brody helped me with. You actually remember this? You helped cover this event, but it was the Top Golf Tour Championship. So me and my buddy qualified.
Who are you playing with? Who'd you play with, Marty?
My friend Chris O'Connor, one of my best friends.
That's right.
Good ball striker. Played at Arizona State. Walked on one.
And real quick, for people that don't have any idea what this was a 2-man golf tournament at Top Golf. Yep. And if you qualified, I think if you were one of the top 2 teams at all the Top Golfs around the country, you went to Vegas.
Yep.
To play in this Top Golf Tour Championship that we actually shot and cut together and put it up on YouTube. And I'm sure they're still out on YouTube to this day.
Yes, yeah, it was actually the top 1 team. So it
was only one team. Okay.
One team from your local Top Golf. So me and my buddy qualified 2 years in a row, and so I had Brody. So we looked at the layout of the Top Golf in Las Vegas was different than the one in Scottsdale, where the targets are, how big they were, the end of the range, and so I knew the scoring, and I was like, hey Brody. I didn't know the right strategy. Should I go try to make it all in all the short targets a lot of the time, or should we take more risk and go to the end ones and maybe run the risk that my dispersion wouldn't be as good? So I was like, hey, Brody, look at my data. Tell me what to do. So Chris, tell Shane about how that little analysis went.
Yeah, it immediately triggered my kind of golf metrics 13-year-old days, because I was on Google Earth trying to figure out how wide every target was. So I literally was there's a ruler function in Google Earth. You're like, okay, that target is 10 yards wide, that one's 15, that one's 20. And then it was like, oh, well, we have player test data from Marty hitting pitching wedges, 7 irons, 4 irons. That's kind of what the different distances were. And so I was like, okay, I can take Marty's player test data, map it on to those different targets, and I can figure out what his expected points are if he only hits pitching wedges, or only hits 7 irons, or only hits 4 irons. And I gave him a recommendation. I was like, hey, Marty, I think the second target is the way to go. That looks like your highest expected points. And I also gave him what's your range of outcomes? If you want to get aggressive or you need to get a ton of points this set, which one has the highest variance? So I tried to get pretty nuanced, but then I don't know, Marty can probably tell us, but the funny part to me about this story is I was pretty proud I did analysis for what Marty's strategy should be. Maybe questionable to do it on work time. That's a different story also. And then Marty goes to Top Golf and completely throws out the entire analysis.
Oh, Marty, what are you doing?
We started with a couple things, Shane. It was super windy.
That's right. I remember that. Yeah.
And actually the terrain there on the Vegas Top Golf is not flat. So everyone kept kind of the winds off the left, hitting these slicey 4 irons over to the right. They'd hit this bank and it'd roll back in and get in the target for super high points. So I was like, okay, we didn't capture that in the analysis. Nothing wrong with the analysis, but you
know what? Next year we should have flown Brody out.
Exactly.
Then he could have walk the space and really got it all done.
Yeah, so
that's so funny.
We lost in the semifinals.
I think you always have to know what could be wrong with your analysis when you're doing it. And I was just treating everything like it's, I don't know, wherever it carries is where it goes. And I kind of knew in the back of my head, the balls can definitely bounce in. And I was like, I don't know if I can capture that very well. But that ended up being like the reason why he ended up changing his strategy, because he could aim for the far target. If it missed, it would bounce into the back wall, and it was like, all right, that's pretty good.
Yep.
That's better than I could have dreamed up.
We needed the whole 3D contour out there.
Yeah,
but,
we need to have a ball flight model with bounce and roll. I messed up.
Yeah, it was fun.
Marty, there's two guys listening to this right now that qualified like out of Myrtle Beach who were probably drinking like Miller Lights the whole time going, we shouldn't have flown to Vegas. If this guy's analyzing the targets and got guys, the smartest guys in the room figured it out. Maybe I was in the wrong fight.
My whole data science team behind me there, still didn't get it done. You still got to hit the shots.
It was like $50K. I think it was worth doing that.
Shane,
it was
still
definitely
hurts,
worth
man.
I was hoping for a 5% coach's fee. I was pushing.
You know what? You got to negotiate on the front end. This is the same thing like your dad. You had to get somebody in there to negotiate on the front end.
Yep.
It's actually $2 an hour, Dad. That's what we're going to do here. Marty, got anything else for Broadie before we let him get back to work?
No, I think for the those listening out there with youngsters just going into college or high school, and they're like, hey, how can I use math and use it to apply it in sports? I mean, I think what's fun about Broadie is like the real life example has made an enormous impact on the industry, combining, math, modeling, physics skills, and really helping out a lot of golfers play better golf and improve club fitters out there as well. So I just think it's very fun and exciting to have Broadie here on our team and, kind of embody that combination of skills and how you can apply them in the golf industry. So Broadie, thanks for being on the pod, brother.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marty. Thanks so much, Shane.
Absolutely. That is Chris Broadie. This is the Ping Proving Grounds podcast.